Well, hello, everybody. I am Daniel Breen, professor here at Brandeis University, and I'm very pleased to be joining you this afternoon for a discussion of the Watergate scandal here on what is, after all, the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-in, which happened on June 17th, 1972. So what I propose to do is talk about some key moments in the Watergate affair. And if any of them, even one of them, had not occurred the way it did, maybe we would ultimately have not heard much of Watergate. But I think a good way to understand the story is by thinking of it in terms of six really important episodes or decisions, maybe seven if we have time, that really tell the story of Watergate. And if you want to learn more about Watergate, which of course has been extensively documented in a number of books, I think maybe the best book is the most recent book, a book about Watergate by Garrett Graff. So if you want to pick that up to learn more, I certainly heartily recommend it. So let's begin more or less at the beginning of the affair that became known as Watergate, an affair, of course, that has ended up giving its name, Gate, to all manner of different scandals over the past 50 years. 200 separate scandals are now known as various gates because of Watergate, which occurred first back in 1972. We all have our favorite gates. Some of them are very famous. Korea Gate is one of the most famous of the gates. One of my favorites is Gular Gate. I'm not sure what Gular Gate is, but it took place in Azerbaijan. That's about all I know about it. But there's also Gate Gate. Gate Gate actually was an event in Great Britain where a leading member of parliament got a little bit insulted because he was not allowed in the main gate at 10 Downing Street to see the prime minister. He had to go into some sort of average Joe pedestrian gate. He complained about it, things got out of hand, and the resulting scandal became known as Gate Gate. Well, all that aside, now let's look at the real, most important of all gates, Watergate. And that story, I think, begins with the first episode in our story, which followed from the inauguration of Richard Nixon as the President of the United States in January, of course, of 1969. Now, when Nixon became president, one thing he really didn't like was any kind of reminder of the two Democrats who had preceded him, of course, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. His dislike of any such reminder went to the point of Nixon's order that no secretary or administrator in the White House or at the old executive office building could even have a picture of Johnson or Kennedy on their desks. They all had to go, even though these were permanent employees. And one thing that Nixon decided was that there should be no taping system at the White House as there had been in Lyndon Johnson's day. Johnson had a taping system. That was just a reminder that Lyndon Johnson had once been there. So Nixon gave the order not long after he became president to rip out the taping system that Johnson had in the White House. And for that reason, perhaps maybe there never would have been anything that we would think of as Watergate tapes, subject to all manner of subpoenas a little bit later on. But then something happened to make Nixon change his mind. And that had a lot to do with Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor. One thing that frustrated Nixon was that during his first term in the White House, leading up to 1971, Nixon would act like a hawk on Vietnam issues while he was in the Oval Office with Nixon. That is, Kissinger would act like a hawk when he was in the Oval Office with Nixon. But then Kissinger, after hours, would sometimes hit the cocktail circuit, and he would talk to all his old Ivy League friends, many of them progressives. And Nixon had the impression that Kissinger was acting like a dove, out talking to his old friends, maybe from Harvard days. Kissinger would sometimes say things like he was the only one restraining that madman Nixon from committing grievous errors in Vietnam. And Nixon didn't like what he considered to be this two-faced nature of Kissinger. Nixon wanted a way ultimately to set the record straight. And that meant having a record of conversations that actually took place in the Oval Office. And so in 1971, Nixon, in conversation with Haldeman, H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, made the decision that maybe there ought to be a taping system reinstalled in the White House so there'd be a way to know who said what to whom. And so we eventually got the most famous taping system of all time, the taping system in the Oval Office. But not just the Oval Office, also Camp David, where, of course, presidents have a hideaway retreat, and in Nixon's office at the old executive office building. So I believe there are actually 3 taping systems. Now, nobody was really supposed to know about these taping systems. One of the very few who did was H.R. Haldeman's, the chief of staff deputy, this man here, Colonel Alexander Butterfield. Butterfield had flown 98 combat missions in Vietnam. He was a pretty impressive guy. Very good administrator. H.R. Haldeman really depended on him. So he was the go-to guy in trying to get this taping system installed, which he did in 1971. Butterfield, by the way, although it's hard to see why, was once named most collegiate-looking male at UCLA back in his college days. So the taping system was installed, and it was all ready to go by the early part of 1971. But again, nobody was supposed to know about it. And Nixon, who was a bit of a technological klutz, I think he would have been pretty bad at screen sharing in the days of Zoom, for example, wanted there to be no obvious way for anybody to know that there was a taping system. So the way the system worked was Nixon didn't have to remember to turn it on or turn it off or anything like that. As soon as anybody spoke, as soon as the taping system picked up the human voice, it would start to roll. And that's the way it was beginning in 1971. That leads us finally to our second episode. Now we have a taping system. What would ultimately become of it? Well, we'll see that a little bit later. But the reason the taping system ultimately became important was because of something happened a little later in 1971. In fact, in the late spring of 1971. And that was the publication in the New York Times of the famous Pentagon Papers. And these were descriptions of all manner of lies and deceptions committed by American administrations in regard to Vietnam, beginning especially in the early 1960s. The Pentagon Papers, of course, had been revealed to the New York Times by this man here, Daniel Ellsberg, who laboriously, page by page, as an employee in the RAND Corporation, had copied 7,000 pages of top secret material about decision-making in regard to Vietnam. Now, when the Pentagon Papers were published, and this became national news, of course, one wonders why Nixon would have cared, because if anybody looked bad in regard to this, it would have been John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. It would not have been Nixon because he was a Republican and he was not making decisions about Vietnam in the early 1960s. But something about the Pentagon Papers did bother Nixon a great deal. He became obsessed with the idea that Daniel Ellsberg, the man responsible for the copying and publication, ultimately of the Pentagon Papers, may be part of some greater group, maybe some greater left-wing conspiracy that may have contacts in the White House itself and may be preparing future leaks, future confidential information to be released that may perhaps make Nixon and those around him look bad. So this is what he said to H.R. Haldeman, very worried about Daniel Ellsberg. "We can't drop this, Bob. You can't drop this, Bob," said Nixon. "You can't let the Jew steal that stuff and get away with it." Ellsberg was actually a Christian Scientist, but these kinds of nuances tended to escape Nixon. So Nixon was determined to find out who around him, maybe in the White House, might perhaps be leaking information or be able to leak information. And so, based upon this worry, Nixon ordered his very close White House counsel, sometimes known as his hatchet man, Charles Colson, to try to put together a way, maybe a team of people that, if necessary, could bug phones and figure out who might be talking to the press, and maybe also, while they were at it, dig up some dirt on Daniel Ellsberg. Colson, by the way, among other things, seems to have orchestrated the famous Hard Hat riots in Lower Manhattan right after Kent State by urging contacts in the union movement to send construction workers to attack Vietnam War protesters, as they famously did on May 8th, 1970, as you see in this picture. So what was to be done to try to figure out a way to prevent leaks from happening or investigate leaks if they did? And ultimately, Colson, in association with the man you see on the left, that's John Ehrlichman, also a very close insider in the Nixon White House, they began to put together a team of people that could act, if necessary, to stop leaks and get to the bottom of who might be leaking information. As Nixon said, "I don't want to be told why anything like this can't be done. The government cannot survive," Nixon said. "It cannot function if anyone can go out and leak. I don't give a damn how it's done, just stop the leaks." And so they put together a team of operatives who might be able to do that. Soon joining this team was a former CIA operative named E. Howard Hunt, who just then was also working as a spy novelist. And soon, shortly after that, signing on to the team was this man here, a former FBI operative named G. Gordon Liddy, who liked to regale secretaries at the White House with tales about how, if necessary, he could actually kill somebody with a pencil. Liddy wanted to call this new team that people at the White House were putting together Odessa, named after a group of a network of former SS officers who were said to be still at large. But the team soon acquired a different name, because one of the people helping put the team together was a guy named Bud Crow, and one of Crow's comrades, a man who also worked for Henry Kissinger, was a guy named David Young. And when David Young's grandmother asked him, "What are you doing there at the White House? What are you up to?" David Young was saying, I'm helping to plug leaks. So David Young's grandmother said, "Oh, that must mean you're a plumber." So this group of people, among which were Hunt and Liddy, would never be known as Odessa. They would henceforth and always be known as the Plumbers Unit. The name stuck. And they soon began to think of things that they might want to do. And luckily, some of these plans were squelched right away. Liddy wanted to dose secretly Daniel Ellsberg with LSD so he would go out in public and make a fool of himself and lose all credibility. Luckily, that didn't happen. Another plan that Nixon seems to have thought was a good idea was to break into the liberal institution, the Brookings Institution in Washington, to see who there might be talking to people at the White House. Luckily, that didn't happen because Chuck Colson suggested that they could start a fire at the Brookings Institution, and that would create a diversion that would allow the plumbers to go in and do what they had to do. Luckily, it didn't happen. Well, there was no doubt that Nixon was a pretty secretive personality. What was he, however, really worried about in terms of who might be leaking information to the press or institutions like the Brookings Institution? What was he afraid that anybody was going to find out in terms of what was happening at the White House or what had happened at the White House? And for this, we don't have a whole lot of information about what was specifically in Nixon's mind. Why really was he so worried about leaks to the extent of hiring what amounted to a secretive team to make sure such leaks would not happen and investigate them if they did? Well, there's a few theories about this, but one of the most interesting theories has to do with the woman in the middle of this picture, who, as you can see, is Anna Chennault. And the story goes, endorsed by some historians, although not conclusively proven, was that near the close of the 1968 campaign, with Hubert Humphrey gaining in the polls significantly, a race that was looking closer all the time, Lyndon Johnson seemed on the verge of a breakthrough in regard to peace talks with the North Vietnamese. The deal seems to have been that if Johnson would stop the bombing of North Vietnam, then the North Vietnamese would agree to meaningful talks that might lead to a ceasefire. And if that had happened, then that would be such big news. Humphrey would probably surge even more in the polls as a Democrat, Johnson's vice president after all, and maybe even win the White House. So the story goes that to prevent that from happening, what Nixon may have done was urge very significant Republican donor Anna Chennault to use her contacts with the South Vietnamese to urge the South Vietnamese not to agree to any such deal, on the assumption Anna Chennault was told to convey to the South Vietnamese that if the South Vietnamese did not agree to the deal, they would get a better deal from Nixon once he became president. A promise, if it was ever made, that proved to be completely false. And one way or another, the South Vietnamese did refuse to consent. And so any kind of a deal that might have been reached was not reached. And as a consequence, the bombshell didn't happen and Humphrey lost by just a whisker at the end of 1968. There is some evidence that Nixon had actually organized this. And perhaps the leak that Nixon was really worried about was the leak of this story to the press, which would have made him look unpatriotic, which would have made him look mendacious, which might have hurt his chances in 1972. And that might account for the ultra-secretiveness of his stance towards information in the White House. Again, we don't know, but that is just a leading theory. So that brings us to incident number 3. Now we're in the beginning of 1972. We have a taping system, a secret taping system at the White House, and we have these plumbers operating out of the old executive office building, responsible to figures high up in the White House, who, among other things, remember, had actually broken into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. Now that brings us finally to episode number 3. And that is the decision to bring the plumbers in to the committee to reelect the president, called by the White House the CRP, always referred to in language as CREEP. Now, the reason the committee to reelect the president was called that was they had a focus group at the beginning of 1972, and people seemed to respond more favorably to the title Committee to Reelect the President than they did to the Committee to Reelect Nixon. And so the name stuck, and it became forever after CREEP. The story goes like this. Now it's early 1972, and John Mitchell and John Dean, who you see here, Mitchell on the left and Dean on the right, sat down with G. Gordon Liddy to see how the plumbers might be useful to Nixon's reelection campaign, perhaps as independent contractors of CREEP. So the meeting took place in early 1972, and at that meeting, G. Gordon Liddy outlined his plans for what the plumbers might do to help in the effort to reelect Nixon. John Mitchell at this time was Attorney General of the United States. Remember, he would soon become the head of CREEP, but I don't think at the time of the meeting he had actually assumed that position. John Dean was a White House counsel, and what he would do for the next several months was help transfer money from CREEP coffers, campaign coffers, to members of the plumbers who would be engaged in the kind of activities that Liddy was now about to outline. So picture the meeting here with Liddy, Attorney General Mitchell on the left, Dean on the right, that they had about how Liddy might be of service. And Liddy had all sorts of plans. And he put all these plans together under the code name Gemstone. So one thing Liddy suggested that he and the plumbers might do for CREEP is perhaps oversee an operation whereby an airplane could follow the airplane of Democratic candidates and secretly record the candidates that the Democrats were having in the airplane so that Nixon in the Republican National Campaign Committee would be better informed about what the Democrats were up to. That's one thing that was proposed. Another proposal, Liddy said, was this: we can compile a list of prospective protesters at the Republican convention coming up in Miami. We could drug them. We could take these protesters down to Mexico. We could keep them there for the duration of the convention so they wouldn't cause any trouble. That was one idea. Another idea that Liddy proposed was to maintain a houseboat outside the Democratic National Convention, lure key Democrats to the houseboat, and then photograph them in compromising positions with call girls. So these two lawyers, Mitchell and Dean, were listening to this entire proposal of Gemstone, and they never said, no, we're not going to do any of that. We're not going to do any of that. And remember, John Mitchell was Attorney General of the United States at the time. But the only reason that they really objected, especially Mitchell, to these plans was that they were going to be really expensive. Imagine how much it's going to cost to hire an airplane to follow various Democratic candidates. So what they really wanted, especially Mitchell, was for Liddy to tone this down some. And it turned out that there was one item on Liddy's agenda that might not be so expensive, and that was to simply break in at the headquarters of various Democratic candidates, especially Edmund Muskie, who Nixon and the Republicans were especially worried about in 1972. Now, that might not be so expensive, and Liddy had this plan, it's called Opal, to break in at various candidates' headquarters, and that seemed to be the direction that Mitchell was leading Liddy towards pursuing, at least as a consequence of this meeting. So that's in the spring of 1972. Fatefully, Opal, this idea of break-ins, would be the one that would eventually be engineered by the plumbers, as we know, and that seems to be the one favored by Mitchell and the higher-ups at CREEP. Later on, as head of CREEP, Mitchell, who was also a resident of the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., would assure Liddy that there would be at least $250,000 available for enterprises that Liddy and the plumbers would engage in. Not a whole lot of money, but certainly enough for a series of break-ins, if in fact that's what they decided to do. And then a little later in the spring, April, I believe, it so happened that Mitchell, Dean, and others were down at Key Biscayne, the estate of Bibi Rebozo, where Nixon liked to hang out and relax. Also there, Dean might not have been there, but I know that Jeb Magruder was there. Magruder was Mitchell's deputy at the committee to re-elect the president. There was a meeting there in April, and it appears at that meeting that maybe Mitchell, but certainly Jeb Magruder, Mitchell's deputy, raised the idea of maybe, as part of Opal, breaking in at the Watergate Hotel, where the Democratic Party had its headquarters, and where Democratic National Chairman Larry O'Brien, of course, had his desk in his office. Maybe that would be a good place to break in, and maybe that's the shape Opal should take. Liddy seems not to have thought of that, but at that meeting, the idea seems to have been broached. And although maybe nothing much was decided, Liddy now took the ball and ran with it. And by the way, while we're on the topic, I did want to mention that Jeb Magruder, Mitchell's deputy, and G. Gordon Liddy did not get along very well. Liddy didn't like Magruder. One day, Liddy and Magruder were in an elevator, and Magruder, who was a creep guy, committee to re-elect the president, was complaining about the way Liddy would keep track of some of the money he was spending. And at one point in the elevator, Magruder put his arm around Liddy, which was a mistake, because as soon as Magruder did that, Liddy turned to Magruder and said, "If you do not remove your hand from my shoulder, I will rip your arm out of your socket and beat you to death with it." That's G. Gordon Liddy. Now, based upon that story and everything else we know, bringing Liddy and Hunt, but maybe especially Liddy, over to the committee to re-elect the president was a pretty risky move. Who knows what these guys were going to do? And if they got caught, who knows perhaps what the consequence of that would be. It's not exactly a safe thing to do, having people like this working for the committee to re-elect the president. But an even bigger mistake happened that spring when Creep and Mitchell and those around them decided to bring James McCord on to the team, among which were the plumbers that were now going to be engaged in various parts of Operation Opal. Now, James McCord had not been a plumber. He was also an ex-CIA guy, but in the spring of 1972, he was actually an employee of the Republican National Committee and the committee to re-elect the president. So he wasn't like an independent contractor like these plumbers were. He was actually an employee, and the problem with bringing him on board was not his expertise. He knew a lot about security. That was certainly true. The problem was that if anything were to happen, and if McCord were to be caught in the act of some of these activities as part of Opal that the plumbers might be up to, then that would be especially damaging, because the police would know right away that McCord worked for Creep and McCord worked for the RNC. And how could you paint any operation that the police might be onto as a rogue operation if a full-time employee of Creep was actually involved? It was really a mistake to bring on McCord to this entire enterprise. But Liddy seems to have wanted him there, and so did Mitchell and Hunt. And so McCord would now be in on the planning of the part of Opal that would produce the break-in at the Watergate Hotel. And in fact, McCord was very closely in on the planning, so that in May of 1972, a month after Magruder, Mitchell, and Liddy had that meeting in Key Biscayne, McCord had actually gone to the Watergate and posed as the uncle of a Democratic Party staff member and wandered through Democratic Party headquarters just to case the joint to decide where the bugs ought to go once the actual break-in happened. And so the stage was set for, of course, the most famous episode of all, the fourth episode in our story, the actual break-in at the Watergate Hotel. So there's the Watergate right there in all its glory, still an extremely prestigious address, still a really important hotel in Washington. You can stay there for over $600 a night, maybe a little bit less if you get a bargain. And as a matter of fact, if you want to, you can stay in the suite that was Democratic Party national headquarters in June of 1972. They call it the Scandal Suite. It'll cost you about $1,500, but you can stay there if you want to. The Watergate was a fairly controversial place when it was put up in the middle of the 1960s. You can just take one look at it and you can see it doesn't look like most of the other buildings in Washington, D.C. So one architectural critic very famously said that putting the Watergate in Washington, D.C. was like hiring a stripper for your grandmother's funeral. Be that as it may, a lot of important people lived there. Members of the Nixon administration liked it because it's like a 25-minute walk to the White House from there. That's why the Mitchells lived at the Watergate, for example, as did other key people. But tonight we're concerned, of course, with the break-in at the temporary suite that was Democratic Party national headquarters. The original break-in had happened, I believe, in late May, where the plumbers had put some bugs on phones, especially Larry O'Brien's phone. But the difficulty, and they didn't get caught doing it, they were successful in that. The difficulty was that the conversations they were hearing from the bug on Larry O'Brien's phone were, first, not that interesting, and second, sometimes hard to hear. There seemed to be a lot of static on it, that maybe the bug wasn't very good. And John Mitchell, head of CREEP, didn't much like any of that information. He was very frustrated. I mean, what are we paying for? But this was a completely valueless operation. And Liddy seems to have taken that to heart, and he decided the way to fix this was to go back in, break back in to the Watergate and put better bugs, more professionally installed perhaps, on O'Brien's phone. So the stage was set for the events of the evening of Saturday, June 17th, 1972. The way it worked was the plumbers would go back into the Watergate. Liddy and Hunt would man a command post during the operation at the Howard Johnsons across the street from the Watergate. And there'd also be various lookouts paying attention to the door just to make sure the police didn't show up to warn the plumbers, the burglars, if in fact such a warning became necessary. The people who actually went into the Watergate surreptitiously were McCord, who was basically in charge there, and the famous 4 Cubans, all of them who had done some work with the plumbers in the past. They're called the 4 Cubans, but in fact, only 3 of them were of Cuban ancestry. The 4th man, and this is the most curious part of the entire story, was a CIA guy named Frank Sturgis. And Frank Sturgis had a very checkered past. Among many other things, in the late 1950s, he seems to have been involved with training Castro's army in Cuba during the days leading up to the great insurrection of 1958 and early 1958, very early 1959. But then after that, Sturgis apparently was involved with efforts to put poison in the face cream of Castro's girlfriend, so that maybe that way poison pills could be administered to Castro, putting an end to his dictatorship in the very early years. Sturgis, needless to say, was a pretty fascinating, shady figure. I read once that the FBI had a 17,000 dossier on Frank Sturgis. I'm not sure if that is true. At any rate, here he is. It's June 17th, 1972, and Frank Sturgis is there with 3 Cubans and McCord at the Democratic National Headquarters. Now, as they went in, one thing McCord did was put a piece of tape on the basement door leading to the parking garage so that they could easily get in and out if they wanted to. The mistake he made, though, was he put the tape vertically. He put the tape horizontally like that so that anybody looking at the door would see parts of the tape. If he put it vertically, then nobody could see it if the door was shut. But McCord had put the tape horizontally. He didn't think that would make much difference. Custodians, when they want a door not to be locked all the time, would sometimes put a tape on the door. And so that's what he did. Puts the tape on the door, goes in, and now they begin to go up to the upper floors where the Democratic National Committee was. Faithfully, however, shortly after that, a security guard at the Watergate, a guy named Frank Wills, who made about $80 a week as security guard, noticed the tape on his rounds. And he didn't think much of it. Maybe it's just a maintenance guy, forgot to take the tape off. So dutifully, Wills took the tape off the door, and I think then went out to get a bite to eat or something. McCord came back down and he saw the tape missing from the door. At that point, McCord called Hunt and Liddy over at the Howard Johnsons. And McCord said, look, somebody has taken the tape off. Somebody knows maybe we're here. And Hunt at that point said, just call the whole thing off. You guys get out of there. We'll do this some other night, but we can't take the risk now of being discovered. And that was probably good advice. Just stop the whole operation. But McCord wanted to keep going, and so did Liddy. Hunt was outvoted. And as a consequence, McCord put another tape on the door and went back up to what he had been doing. And shortly after that, Wills came back. He sees the tape back in the door, and now Wills knows something is up. This isn't just some maintenance person. It's after hours. There's probably burglaries going on. And Wills did the right thing. He called the DC police to come check this out. Meanwhile, McCord and the burglars, they're still upstairs. And very quickly, the police did show up. And one of the most curious parts of the story is the fact that these particular policemen were plainclothes policemen. I think they've been investigating drug crimes. They were actually dressed as hippies. So Liddy's lookouts, seeing these people go into the Watergate, had no reason to know they were policemen and didn't call McCord and the burglars to tell them, get out of there, get out of there. Instead, nothing much happened as these undercover policemen went upstairs. They saw the lights at Democratic Party National Headquarters. They opened the door, they shouted, hands up, and now the burglars were arrested here on Saturday, June 17th, 1972. Things happened fairly quickly after that. But one important thing to be noted was very shortly after the arrests were made, DC investigators found the hotel room where the burglars have been staying. And by finding the hotel room, they also found address books that the burglars had. And those address books, I think two of them had E. Howard Hunt's name in them. One of them had WH for White House after E. Howard Hunt. Hunt, of course, was a plumber. He had all these White House contacts. And now the police had a way to trace these burglars, the Cubans in McCord, to Hunt, and maybe through them to somebody at the White House. So this was actually a troublesome thing. No wonder a meeting took place 2 days later on Monday between John Dean and G. Gordon Liddy. Now, Liddy had not been arrested yet, but he was sure to be arrested soon. And Liddy told Dean, look, you guys can take me out if you want to. Liddy told Dean, I will be standing on this particular street corner at this particular time of day. If you want to come by and have somebody rub me out, I'll understand. That way you'll know that I'll never talk. Dean told Liddy, don't worry, it doesn't have to come to that. But instead, what Dean seems to have communicated was that the legal fees of the burglars, those who've been arrested and would soon be arrested, would be paid by somebody, probably out of creep funds. And the rest of the story mostly has to do with how that, which amounted to a cover-up, was actually engineered. Most importantly, after that Monday, just a few days later, there took place a meeting on June 23rd in the White House, a meeting attended by Haldeman, as you see there on the left sitting down, and the President of the United States, Richard Nixon. Nixon had, of course, known about the break-in. The break-in was on all the papers. Who knows what it was? Maybe it was just in the public side, this rogue operation. Nobody knew much about it yet. The investigators hadn't, of course, publicized much of what they had found. And Nixon and Haldeman really wanted to keep it that way, but how could they? It wasn't just the DC police looking into it. It was also the FBI, because after all, these are wiretaps. That's a federal offense. And the FBI was getting pretty close to linking all of these people to people in the White House and also creep. And so the question was, how could this be prevented from becoming a national scandal that would implicate the White House? And at 10 a.m. on June 23rd, the meeting began, and Haldeman soon broached this idea. To stop the FBI from looking further into it, what if we were to paint this as a national security issue? And that would allow us to get the CIA to call the FBI to maybe at least cool their heels on this and stop being so directly involved. And that would make it just a DC burglary. At that point, in that meeting, Nixon agreed to what Haldeman suggested, using the CIA to call off the FBI. And that amounts to very, I think strongly, obstruction of justice. And that's why that June 23rd meeting gave rise to the tape that's always known in Watergate lore as the smoking gun. That was June 23rd, 1972. And shortly after that, indeed, the FBI was called off by the CIA. And this became, at least for the time being, purely a local DC matter. The other thing, really importantly, that happened that week was that Martha Mitchell, the wife of the Attorney General, John Mitchell, was very concerned about the news of Watergate. She knew James McCord personally, and she long suspected that John Mitchell, her husband, had been up to things that probably weren't legal. And to talk about what she was afraid of, she called Helen Thomas, famous intrepid reporter at the UPI, from where she was staying in Los Angeles. She got on the phone with Helen Thomas, began to talk to Helen Thomas late at night during this phone conversation. And at some point in the conversation, Helen Thomas heard Martha Mitchell yell, "You get away, you get away," followed by silence because the FBI person or former FBI person who was minding her at that apartment was a guy named Steve King. And Steve King seems to rip the phone off the wall so that Martha Mitchell couldn't keep talking to Helen Thomas. There's Steve King now. In 2017, Steve King was appointed the ambassador to Czechoslovakia. One of the most curious things of that whole tumultuous week. But as of the end of the week, it now looks maybe as if Watergate wouldn't be as big of a story as it could have been. And it may well have been that Nixon could have gotten away with this decision to authorize what amounted to a cover-up. There were going to be payments made to the burglars to help keep their silence, and the FBI was not going to look too closely into it. Prosecutors from the Justice Department seems to have agreed to this. The only thing that was keeping Watergate in the news at all were the reporting of Woodward and Bernstein for the Washington Post, who little by little were establishing that, in fact, these burglars at the Watergate perhaps had money from the committee to reelect the president and had been up to all sorts of other things, perhaps, than this particular break-in. Maybe that wasn't an isolated affair. They reported on it, famously tracing the money that the burglars had in their possession back to Creep and to people around Creep. And the only thing that seemed to bother Nixon as he was riding high in the polls on his way to a major victory over George McGovern that year was where could Woodward and Bernstein be getting this information? And the leading theory was somebody at the FBI must be giving them the information. And H.R. Haldeman, in one conversation with Nixon, said that the most likely figure to be leaking that information was probably this man here, Mark Felt, the number 2 guy at the FBI. Nixon wondered aloud to Haldeman, how can we stop Felt from leaking information if indeed he is the leak, if he is the one doing it? And Nixon said to Haldeman, maybe we could buy him off. Maybe we could appoint him head of the FBI. And at that point, Haldeman told Nixon that he thought that Mark Felt might be Jewish. And this is what Nixon said in response, quote, "Christ, I'm not going to put another Jew in there. Mark Felt is certainly a Jewish name." Nixon said, well, that could explain it too. Well, as long as everybody kept quiet about this, maybe nothing much would have happened even now. Woodward and Bernstein could report all this as much as they wanted, but there were other things going on in 1972. It wasn't affecting the race for president, which in fact Nixon still won in a landslide, despite Woodward and Bernstein's reporting about the links between the burglars and the committee to re-elect the president. John Mitchell resigned. He was the only major figure so far to be punished for any of this. And as far as Nixon and a lot of the public was concerned, well, that's that. Nothing much to worry about. As of the beginning of 1973, after Nixon's victory in the 1972 election, he was riding high in the polls. He had a 67% approval rating. All that had to happen now was the burglars go on trial. It's the DC court. No big deal. They're getting their hush money. They're getting paid. They keep silent, and that's all. That's all there would be to it. Nixon was looking forward to a successful second term. And not long after he won, we know that over a few glasses of scotch, he had a conversation with Chuck Colson, delightedly making plans for the administration to come. Here's one thing he said: never forget, he had been caught on tape saying, never forget, said to his aides, the press is the enemy, the press is the enemy, the press is the enemy, the establishment is the enemy, the professors are the enemy, the professors are the enemy. And there's every reason to think that once he became a second-term president, he could fix his enemies once and for all. What could make a difference? Well, what made a difference were episodes 5 and 5A. What happened now was the Watergate burglars are going to go on trial very quickly in January of 1973. Just before the trial, most of them pled guilty. The 4 so-called Cubans pled guilty. Hunt was going to plead guilty. McCord and Liddy, however, were going to go to trial. So now there's going to be a trial. And the judge was going to be this guy here, Judge John Sirica, known as Maximum John for the heaviness of his sentences. And if you are a criminal defendant, maybe you don't want a judge named Maximum John presiding over your future. Sirica had been a lawyer ever since the middle of the 1920s, the son of Italian immigrants, and he was nobody's fool. And as Liddy and McCord went on trial, Sirica increasingly had the feeling that the witnesses that the prosecutors were calling were not telling everything they knew. And the prosecutors weren't being very zealous in getting them to tell things that they knew. Sirica did not think the defense was putting on a very healthy defense of Liddy and McCord, almost as if everything had already been settled and somehow some sort of fix was in. Sirica strongly suspected that people were holding things back, maybe they were lying, and he kept intervening in the trial and asking his own questions of witnesses. For example, Sirica asked Hugh Sloan, the treasurer of CREEP, why did somebody like Liddy have access to over $200,000? What's going on there? Hugh Sloan answered, I have no idea. So Sirica was bothered by this. Nobody seems to want to know the truth about this. And he made no bones about it. Should there be a conviction, he was going to throw the book at McCord and Liddy. McCord and Liddy. They were going to get as high a sentence as you could throw at them, and he was going to give the people who pled guilty very high sentences too. But what he really wanted was for people to talk, to actually get to the bottom of this, and nobody seemed besides him involved in this trial to want to do it. All Sirica could do was signal his refusal to show any leniency, as McCord and Liddy were found guilty not long after the beginning of the trial. Sentencing was scheduled for March 23rd, 1973. And because the burglars knew that the sentences were going to be pretty stiff, Sirica had made no secret about that. Obviously, they wanted more money that they'd been gathering all along, courtesy of John Dean, transferring money from CREEP sources to burglar accounts as often as he had to. And so it was Dean that heard that burglars, and especially Hunt, really wanted more money now that they were going to have to take a very heavy fall. Hunt wanted $100,000, for example, as the continuing price for his silence. So that March 21st, I think, right before the sentencing, Dean went to Nixon, famous meeting in the White House, and Dean told Nixon the burglars wanted more money. This is the conversation, famously, where Dean said there was a cancer growing on the presidency. How much money would the burglars need? Dean said it could be $2 million over the next few years. And Nixon surprised Dean by saying, we could get that. We could get that. In fact, on 12 separate occasions during that meeting, Nixon assured Dean that the money could be gotten, the money could be there. And Nixon told Dean, go talk to Mitchell, still living at the Watergate Hotel, see if you can find different ways to arrange this. And Dean came back from that conversation with renewed authorization for hush money. And here again, we've got obstruction of justice by the President of the United States during that conversation, the third week in March, 1973. And then the great bombshell, and this is maybe 5A in our story, James McCord was about to be sentenced. Liddy was sentenced. Liddy was sentenced for 20 years. It's a huge sentence for something like this. McCord was about to be sentenced, but McCord was in a different position. McCord had never been a plumber. McCord was an RNC CREEP employee. McCord thought that nothing that he did was terribly wrong. He was an employee authorized by Mitchell to do activities, maybe among them this, the break-in at the Watergate. McCord did not think it was fair that somebody like Jeb Magruder, who had lied on the stand during the trial, should escape scot-free, have no penalties, while McCord himself, a patriot who served his country with the CIA, McCord is very proud of that, would have to go to jail. Here was McCord stuck in this DC prison cell, filthy, insects around, facing a very long prison term for something that he didn't think was terribly wrong, but especially when others were not going to be punished similarly, others more responsible. McCord felt that was unjust. So before the sentencing, McCord famously wrote a letter to Sirica, outlined several things that McCord thought the judge should know. Among them was that people who took the stand had perjured themselves, and that people above McCord, people at the White House perhaps, were putting pressure on people not to testify and in effect buying their silence. And Sirica got that letter. He read that letter out in open court, and now Watergate was very much back on the front burner. This was huge news. This is going to break the story open. Now we've got somebody implicating not just Creep, but maybe people above Creep, maybe in the White House itself. And now what happened was McCord, in the bombshell, we're going to be looked into this allegation of a cover-up, not just by DC authorities, but also by a grand jury, also by the Senate Committee in Watergate, famously headed by Sam Ervin, and also by a special prosecutor by the Justice Department, the famous Archibald Cox. And very soon after that, McCord implicated John Dean as the person who had engineered the cover-up. And that meant that John Dean's days at the White House were numbered. He decided to cooperate with the grand jury to say what he knew. Dean's last meeting with Nixon occurred on April 22nd. And on April 30th, Dean was fired by Nixon. Haldeman and Ehrlichman resigned. And now it's the late spring of 1973. And now we've got a whole bunch of people looking into allegations of a cover-up in the Watergate affair, extending to the White House itself. John Dean is going to come clean, and he's going to implicate Nixon's knowledge of all this, buttressing what James McCord had said. Nixon, of course, is going to deny it. And now the whole question is, how do we know who's telling the truth? Because Dean and McCord can say one thing, Nixon's going to say another. I had nothing to do with any of this, no cover-up or anything like that. And probably the presumption would be you got to believe the president in circumstances like that. And maybe even now, things might not have gotten out of hand for Nixon. A lot of people still thought this is not impeachable. We have no way to know if Nixon was actually involved in any of this cover-up business. And that brings us to our last episode for the presentation, episode 6. How do we know who's telling the truth? And now re-entering our story is Alexander Butterfield, who had his dream job by 1973 as head of the Federal Aviation Administration. Now, Butterfield, remember, was one of the very few who knew about the tapes. And when he was called to testify before the Ervin Committee, he really didn't think he'd have to reveal the fact that there were tapes. All the committee really wanted to talk to him about was the way appointments had been arranged at the White House, configuration of seating and things like that, really mundane matters. Butterfield went to talk to the committee just in an out-of-the-way room at the Executive Office building. It wasn't televised at first, just a few people there. And Butterfield told his wife, don't worry about this. They're probably not going to ask me about the tapes. But Butterfield got there in the room. They began to ask him very routine matters. And one thing the committee knew was that now and then, Nixon would ask people he was talking to get up, walk around, go to a new part of the office. And the committee just asked Butterfield, why would Nixon do that? Well, what do you think he was thinking? And at this point, Butterfield said famously, I was hoping you fellows wouldn't ask me that. And he revealed the existence of the taping system, which the committee, of course, was very interested in, because the tapes would reveal what happened in the Oval Office. The tapes would reveal who said what to whom. The tapes would reveal whether Nixon or Dean was telling the truth. And when this story broke, national news, Dean breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't just him anymore that had to be believed on his own credentials. Now there was a way to know who was telling the truth. And from that point on, the rest of the Watergate affair was all about who was going to be able to hear those tapes. Would Nixon have to surrender them, or would some legal way be found out by him to prevent him from having to surrender the tapes? Now, in the interest of time, we do have to conclude here, I'm afraid, but perhaps it's just as well as that we do, because the rest of the affair really was all about the tapes, as various mechanisms of the US government ultimately were able to continue to demand them. Archibald Cox, especially in the Senate Committee on Watergate. Ultimately, that led to a Supreme Court ruling in August of 1974, which meant that Nixon had to surrender those tapes. And that meant that he knew that there was no point really in continuing as president with a Senate, even Republicans in the Senate, seemingly willing to vote to drive him from office in an impeachment proceeding. And that would be ultimately the basis of his decision, as we know, to resign in August of 1974. We can perhaps talk about other matters in the Q&A, but I did want to stop there. We're at the 50-minute mark, and I look forward to joining all of you for Q&A a little bit later. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I'll see you soon. Hey, hello, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. And I want to begin our short question and answer session, first of all, by apologizing for a couple of things. I'm sorry if I appear blue on the screen. I don't have some kind of a dread disease that I contracted since the last time I saw you. It's something about the natural light here in the late afternoon in Waltham. And also, I think at some point in the presentation, I might have said Czechoslovakia when I meant the Czech Republic. So I apologize for that. That, of course, was an error. And I hope I said Martha Mitchell instead of Margaret Mitchell. Sometimes I say Margaret Mitchell when I mean Martha Mitchell because I grew up in Atlanta. But maybe I didn't do that. And for that, at least I have no reason to apologize. So I want to get to a few questions, good questions that many of you have raised. But before I do that, I did want to point out that if I had a little bit more time in the presentation, there would have been a crucial episode number 7 to go with the first 6 that I talked about. And for me, number 7 would have been the Saturday Night Massacre of October 1973, when Nixon caused, eventually through Robert Bork, the Solicitor General at the Justice Department, Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, to be fired. And it was that erratic behavior that really sent Nixon's popularity plummeting. Before the Saturday Night Massacre, that's October 1973, over half of the American people still thought he probably didn't need to be impeached. After that, that critical mass began to lessen in a much less than 50% by the fall of 1973 into the winter of 1974, supported Nixon. And that Saturday Night Massacre was a key juncture in diminishing public support for Nixon continuing to act as president. Now, as far as the questions and answer are concerned, as far as we know, Mark Felt probably was deep throat. And if there's some evidence to the contrary or some controversy about that, I'm not sure what it is. I've never heard any reputable source, at least, question that. There could be just something I don't know about, but the operating assumption is that deep throat was Mark Felt. As far as the famous 18.5-minute gap in the Watergate tapes that Rosemary Woods is responsible for, that's actually an interesting story, because one of the questions is, have we made any progress in recovering what happens to be on that gap in the tapes, maybe a crucial gap? The story at the time, remember, was that when Rosemary Woods was transcribing the elements of the Watergate tapes, she somehow erased 18.5 minutes of it. The interesting thing about what she had said was when she tried to reproduce the course of events, the mistakes that she made, that resulted in that so-called accidental erasure, a lot of authorities figured that what she said she did would not have resulted in the erasure. So there's some controversy about how it happened. But regardless of how it happened, it looks like we're never going to be able to get that back. The National Archives tried for years and years to recover what was on those tapes, that 18.5-minute gap. And not long ago, they announced that as far as they were concerned, there's just no way to do it. So probably unless a miracle happens, we'll never know exactly what was on that tape. And it was an important one because it was in the week immediately after the break-in. So it would have been nice to see what was on there, but we probably never will. Another question has to do with that conversation that Liddy and Dean had on the Monday after the break-in, where Liddy seems to have assured Dean that as far as he was concerned, he would understand if he just had to be rubbed out to ensure his silence. As far as I know, Liddy never talked about that with anybody else. That was just something he raised with Dean during that meeting. Liddy was the ultimate good soldier. He was prepared to go to jail, and it might have been a 20-year jail term for him. But what happened was that although he was sentenced to a very long term, he only served a few years of it because he was pardoned by Jimmy Carter. While Jimmy Carter was president, Carter figured that it wasn't really fair that Liddy goes to jail and the higher-ups, if they went to jail at all, and some of them did, went to jail for lesser terms. And so that was the source of his pardon. The other burglars also went to jail for a while. McCord went to jail, but they didn't get very, very long sentences, as it turned out. They were only in jail for, in many cases, just a few years. Now, as far as the Washington Post is concerned, one question has to do with the way Woodward and Bernstein's reporting may have changed journalism or influenced journalism in the United States. And I think it had a profound impact on journalism. It really did, because that created a very strong expectation that the press ought to serve almost as a quasi-governmental institution, checking up on people in power, reporting on corruption, going into the sources, and bringing to light abuses of power, not just as something that might happen now and then, but maybe something akin to a genuine, important institutional role the press would have in a government dedicated to honest Republican institutions, Republican with a small r, of course, Democratic and Republican institutions. So that the fact that Woodward and Bernstein succeeded so well in what they did and kept Watergate, at least to some extent, in the public eye in the long months until James McCord's revelations, really did, I think, elevate journalism as something with greater stature and something that any kind of a functioning democracy really needs. And maybe one of the bad things about our own current time is that daily newspapers are suffering so much, and the extent to which responsible, trained journalists can have the kind of jobs and positions that would allow them to fulfill this function is very much under threat these days. I think that's something we all have to worry about. Another question has to do with maybe a comparison or contrast between the January 6th hearings and the Watergate hearings of especially the summer of 1973, and then I guess going into the impeachment hearings of the House Judiciary Committee, which was 1974. And I think the big story there might be the contrast between the two, because remember, with the Watergate hearings, Republicans on the Ervin Committee played a pretty important role, and they were important Republicans who served willingly on that committee. Howard Baker, very famously, Lowell Weicker of Connecticut, also pretty famously, they were pretty committed public servants, and they took their duties in that committee seriously. And there was a sense that it was important, one way or the other, to figure out what actually happened. So with Watergate, there were really important Republicans who decided that there was something important about this process and that they ought to be a part of it. There wasn't the sense that we had with January 6th, where most Republicans just call it a partisan witch hunt, leave it at that, and refuse to accept any findings, no matter how scrupulously those findings were held. So there's something about the nature of partisan politics today that differentiates those two hearings. And I think the comparison with Watergate would be all to the Ervin Committee's favor, at least in that case. And I think we just got some questions to come in. One guest asked a pretty good question. Was Dean aware of the taping? And I'm not sure about the answer to that. I think the answer, though, is that he wasn't aware of the taping. He wasn't sure there was taping going on. But I think he reports somewhere that there were times when he suspected that there might be taping going on. And maybe you can see why people might expect there might be taping, because you might be talking to Nixon, and then Nixon might ask you to repeat something, or he might rephrase or what he asked and have you respond to that. Like, are you sure of this? Are you sure of that? And sometimes you might get the feeling that what you were saying was going on some kind of a record and that Nixon knew that. But then again, we can't be sure what Dean knew or anybody else knew about this. And the other thing is, we don't always know how conscious Nixon was of the taping, because he seems to have just gotten used to it. And there were probably plenty of occasions where, although the taping was going on, Nixon just wasn't thinking of it in what he said and what he asked. It was such a matter of course that there were many instances in which it just doesn't seem as if the existence of the tapes really influenced Nixon in what he said and what he asked during White House conferences. And certainly he implicated himself during those conferences and the discussions of hush money. So probably in those cases, he probably simply was, or he knew at some level there was taping going on, but he probably wasn't conscious of it at the time. He wasn't thinking of it, and he just talked as he normally would. And now we have another guest with a question. Did we ever find out why Mark Feld chose to reveal what he knew? Did he not like Nixon? One answer to that, at least, would be that he didn't like Nixon very much. He felt improperly passed over for promotion after spending so many years at the FBI. He, with some reason, thought that the guy who was the director wasn't as effective or as deserving as he was. And some people claim that he had a bit of an axe to grind for that reason. But again, people's motivations are complicated, and I'm not sure we'll ever know the full story of Mark Felt and why he acted as he did. Now, there was another question that I wanted to try to answer. It's a little bit further up here. Let me see if I can find it again. Oh, one of our guests asks, McGovern had a little chance of winning in 1972. Certainly true. What prevented Nixon from understanding this? There's a couple of ways to answer that. One answer is that Nixon was always afraid of some revelation from his past. Nobody knows perhaps what it might have been that might have changed the trajectory of that race. Who knows? Maybe he was worried what the Democrats might know of Nixon's career, which went all the way back into the 50s, of course, on the national stage, 40s really, when he was a member of Congress. That's one way of answering it. He just had the kind of personality that was always afraid of something that somebody else might know. I think a better answer is that he wasn't so much worried about losing in 1972, at least not after it was clear that Ted Kennedy wasn't going to be a candidate, and especially after it was clear that Muskie wasn't going to be the nominee. He wasn't so much afraid of losing. What he really wanted was an earth-shaking, huge victory. He wanted the kind of landslide that would give him the prestige to accomplish more or less what he wanted to accomplish in a second term, even despite the fact that he would have had Congress still in Democratic hands. And if he was going to win a landslide victory, a huge victory, then there couldn't be any kind of a scandal that would get in the way. For example, revelations that would show the public there was this thing called the Plumbers Unit, which would certainly have gotten out if the hush money hadn't been paid when it was in 1972. So to win a landslide victory, he just couldn't have Watergate as bad as it might have been if everybody had talked the way things normally would have happened. And that might have explained his insistence that the CIA call off the FBI as it happened. And I think we're getting to probably the end. I think that's about all we have time for. Maybe this last question here, if social media existed at that time, would have helped to expose or help cover up what the Watergate event, would alternative truths have been developed as it has occurred today? That's an interesting question. Would social media have made a difference back then? I think probably it's better the way it was in 1972 and 1973. The bad thing about social media is somebody might report something, it might be heard, maybe there's a whole bunch of people who can reveal something if they want to, but it's so easily distrusted and so many people can just so casually shut it off. It's just you talking or somebody else talking, who cares? But with the Washington Post, that was a bit different. Those were trained journalists who had done their very, very careful research, as journalists do. And the fact that you had that kind of paper with that kind of stature reporting on it made a difference that I don't think would have been true with social media, as I very slightly alluded to earlier. And I think now that it's 5:02, that might be all we have time for. And I really appreciate your attention and hope you enjoy the presentation on this, the 50th anniversary of the break-in. And I wish you all a good weekend.